Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. The title of today's event is Equal or Erased: Protecting the Rights of Women and Girls in the Age of Gender Identity. My name is Grace Melton. On behalf of the Heritage Foundation and our co-sponsor of this event, Hands Across the Aisle, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today on this last day of the Commission on the Status of Women. The Heritage Foundation is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we have done extensive work on the issue of gender identity, which you can find at heritage.org. We are also recording this event, so you'll be able to see it on our website within a few days. As I think many of you here today know, women have been meeting at the United Nations for about 70 years in this forum to discuss the challenges that women around the world face and to propose policies and solutions to many of these problems. However, until quite recently, one issue that would never have occurred to the women who came here before us to discuss was the definition of women. Most of us here are women, and we know that the word women refers to biological females who have two X chromosomes. We know that many of the challenges that girls and women have historically faced are a result of the biological differences that separate us from men. Now, a relatively new ideology of gender identity threatens to undermine much of the progress that previous generations of women have made toward equality for women and girls. Gender identity refers to a person's self-perception as male, female, both, neither, or something in between. The idea of gender identity is unmoored from biological reality, and as a result, it can and does lead to harmful consequences for women. That is the subject that our expert panel is here to discuss with us today, so please allow me to introduce them. Each of our speakers approaches this topic from a different angle and brings a unique perspective. In fact, there are likely many issues about which they disagree on political, religious, or cultural grounds. But on one particular issue, they all agree, which is that gender identity ideology poses real threats to women and girls. I think it is also important to note that none of us here is suggesting that individuals who identify as transgender are seeking to harm women and girls. Nor are we saying that those individuals are any less entitled to the human rights that we all claim on the basis of our human dignity. First, we'll hear from Dr. Monique Robles, who's a board-certified pediatric critical care physician. She currently serves in various pediatric intensive care units throughout the country and is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center. She received a certificate in healthcare ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center and earned a Master of Science in Bioethics at the University of Mary. Natasha Chart is the board chair of the Women's Liberation Front, a member of the Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, and a writer at Feminist Current. Kaylee Triller is co-founder of Hands Across the Aisle Women's Coalition, an international bipartisan group of women united by their shared opposition to gender identity-based legislation and policy. A survivor of sexual assault, Kaylee was fired from her job of 17 years when she opposed a policy allowing men into girls' locker rooms. She has written extensively on this subject, with her articles appearing in such publications as The Federalist, National Review Online, and Decision Magazine. Nurdine Knight is a research fellow for Yaqeen Institute and the author of 40 Hadith of Aisha, a book that celebrates female scholarship in Islam. She is currently working on her second book, which will examine the relationship between gender, faith, and society. Now I'll turn the floor over to Monique to lead us off.
Thank you, Grace. So I want to thank the Heritage Foundation today for extending an invitation to me to engage in this dialogue, and I thank all of you for coming because I think it's an important topic. I'm truly honored to be here. It's important also for all here today to understand what the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is, its proposed treatment, and its impact on the individual and society in order to think more comprehensively about its effect on women and girls. This was not a focus I encountered during my medical school and residency training. So I began to wonder and question, how have over 40 gender identity clinics associated with children's hospitals appeared in just over a decade? If we think about the definition of sex by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, two major forms of individuals are distinguished respectively as female or male, especially on the basis of their reproductive organs and structures. The sum of the structural, functional, and behavioral characteristics of organisms that are involved in reproduction are marked by the union of gametes that distinguish male and female, respectively spermatozoa and eggs. The definition of the two distinct sexes has come into question with the concept of gender, with this social construct in which one might identify as masculine or feminine. So the diagnosis was previously known as gender identity disorder, which had been characterized with sexual dysfunctions and paraphilias, emphasizing cross-gender identification. However, in 2013, it was replaced with the diagnosis gender dysphoria in the DSM-5 to emphasize gender incongruence. Now, dysphoria is described as a conflict the individual experiences between his or her biological gender and the gender in which he or she identifies or expresses or experiences. And this associated distress is socially induced and not inherent to transgenderism. These individuals have difficulty functioning and may have depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideations. Now, the rationale for the new diagnosis was to reduce the associated stigma, to, quote, depathologize the diagnosis, and to attribute it to a normal variation not to be seen as a mental illness. In other words, it is the result not of patients' psychological difficulties, but their lack of social acceptance. So my question is, why keep the diagnosis in DSM-5 if we are to see it as a normal variation and not a mental health concern? The answer is to allow continued mental health access and healthcare services for these individuals, according to one psychiatrist who helped write the criteria for the DSM-5. And when looking at the criteria that define this diagnosis for children and adolescents, we see that most are subjective. And the diagnostic criteria has really made the male versus female stereotypes even more pronounced. The proposed treatments for this diagnosis are interventions that are off-label. They are not FDA approved, not in the United States, and but yet they are being promoted as standard of care, and they're legal. The first tier is puberty-suppressing hormones, also known as gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist. They're classified as fully reversible, but this is not true. They arrest bone growth, they decrease bone density, they prevent normal pubertal organization and maturation of the adolescent brain, they prevent sperm and egg development. They are started with the intent of further treatment with cross-sex hormones. So the second tier is high-dose cross-sex hormones that are classified as partially reversible. They're used to develop secondary sex characteristics of the desired gender. This is estradiol in male to female, testosterone in female to male, and other progestins. And the suggested age of use is 16. However, some practices are beginning at age 14 or even earlier, such as LA Children's Hospital Transgender Clinic. And so this clinic is even recommending, in some cases, to skip the blockers and start with the high-dose cross-sex hormones. These hormones lead to sterility, and there are many associated health risks. There's a decrease in bone mineral density. There's an increased risk of venous thromboembolic events. There's a development of abnormal lipid profile and metabolic syndrome, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and an increased risk of cancer. And then the final, sex reassignment surgery, is the last tier, which is irreversible. And it's not recommended until patients reach the legal age of majority. But I want to point out something. As of 2019, 28 U.S. states have made specific laws that prohibit female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision, for no medical reason, while the remaining 22 states had no specific laws against this. In 2010, the American Academy of Pediatrics received backlash for advising physicians to consider offering patients, quote, a ritual nick as a possible compromise to avoid greater harm, end quote. The Academy went on to say that even though genital mutilation is illegal in the U.S., physicians in countries where female circumcision is practiced could consider performing it. Due to the negative feedback received, the Academy retracted their statement and then came out in a subsequent statement that it, quote, opposes all types of female genital cutting, quote, end quote. However, mastectomies in the US are occurring as early as 16, however, in California as early as 13. So, allowing girls to be mutilated before the age of majority. Now let's consider the recent AAP statement, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics, of October 2018, entitled, quote, Ensuring Comprehensive Care and Support for Transgender and Gender Diverse Children and Adolescents, end quote. The aim of the statement is solely to affirm or the desired experienced gender at any age. Any attempt at helping a child or adolescent identify with his or her biological sex is considered, per the Academy, quote, unfair and deceptive. And the Academy says watchful waiting is outdated. But the Academy is not addressing the parents of transgender youth. Just after the AAP statement came out, a letter was written from the Gender Critical Parent Forum criticizing the AAP stance, its diagnostic methods, its view of the associated mental health problems, the blinders used in ignoring desistance and detransition, and the lack of the Academy's application of science. Another area that is not being adequately addressed is a phenomenon known as rapid onset gender dysphoria, described and published in a study by Lisa Littman in August of 2018. To generate hypotheses for this phenomenon that is described as a late onset form, it's primarily occurring in peer groups of adolescent females who do not previously meet the criteria for childhood gender dysphoria. And they're seeing that is similar to peer influences as those in eating disorders, suggesting that this has become a social contagion. When we look at over 256 parent-completed surveys meeting the inclusion criteria, the results revealed that over 80% of those meeting the described phenomenon were biologically female adolescent and young adults with a mean age of 16. The well-being of the adolescents and young adults' mental health and relationships with their parents became worse after this diagnosis, or this phenomenon, I should say. And there's an increasing trust in transgender sources and an increased isolation in these individuals. It revealed that in the described phenomenon that over 87% of the adolescents were socially influenced, and that those experiencing it, nearly 63% had one or more diagnoses of psychiatric illness or neurodevelopmental disability preceding the onset. I want to say that the UK has launched an investigation looking into why there has been an over 4,000% increase in the number of girls that have been referred for gender reassignment in the past decade. This represents a bioethical dilemma. I am unaware of any other diagnosis in medicine that has such overreaching threats to society as this one, which all the more should prompt us to question who are we helping and who is benefiting. When I consider individuals with the diagnosis of body identity integrity disorder who desire amputations, how is it really different from those with gender dysphoria? Why is it unethical for a surgeon to amputate a healthy limb but considered a treatment to perform staged sex reassignment surgery? This violates the principle of totality and integrity, which states that removing a part of the body or impairing the body's integrity is justifiable only if it leads to the well-being of the body as a whole. Now, the aim of the guidelines published in 2017 by the Endocrine Society were to provide suggestions and recommendations in caring for transgender individuals. However, there are no standardized treatment protocols. Prospective follow-up studies show that nearly 85% of children diagnosed with gender identity disorder do not persist in remaining gender dysphoric in adolescence. And when we look at the Endocrine Society's guidelines, most of them are categorized as very low to low quality of evidence. So my question is, if over half of the graded recommendations are weak and most are very low to low quality, and a significant percentage of children diagnosed with gender dysphoria do not persist, then what is considered the benefit of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in the treatment of gender dysphoria? Well, it is proposed that the blockers will allow children to decide. However, in a 2011 study evaluating 70 young people between the ages of 12 and 16 to assess gender dysphoria and psychological function before and after puberty suppression, it revealed that of the 70 individuals, none withdrew from puberty suppression and all went on to begin cross-sex hormone treatment. This finding counters the natural course of gender dysphoria, which does not persist in most children. The decision then has been made for these children with commencement of the blockers. There's no other area of medicine that's allowed this much leniency in regards to ethical standards. What about informed consent? Benefits versus risk, alternative therapies, or the option of doing nothing? Parents are being misled by fear and coerced into an affirmation pathway. Children are unable to formally consent because it requires a full understanding of the treatment, its implications and consequences, many which are irreversible. They are not fully formed in their intellectual capacity and decision-making to do so. In an era of evidence-based medicine, the recommended treatment of gender dysphoria is somehow exempt. There are no randomized controlled studies looking at the potential benefits and harms of these blockers and hormones on children. There are no studies looking at psychiatric interventions. And just as concerning is the lack of recognition given to those who regret transitioning and to decide to detransition. These individuals are not given a forum to be heard by the medical community. Medical treatment improves when undesired outcomes and failures are recognized and addressed, but this is not occurring. Any treatment focused on helping the child or adolescent identify with his or her biological gender is considered unethical. Imposing a binary view of gender is discouraged. There are societal implications that are unfolding with blanket strategies to enforce acceptance. Sex education is targeted at younger children. Transgender and gender non-conforming student guidelines are being implemented in schools. Educators who refuse to comply are losing their jobs. Parents who do not agree with the affirmative approach of the gender dysphoric children could run into, quote, legal consequences. And may we say that in the sports arena, biological males identifying as transgender are competing in women's events with an unfair biological advantage, and biological females who claim to be male are allowed the unfair advantage of competing while taking testosterone, which on any other playing field is considered doping. Funding for medical education and training in this ideology is coming from wealthy elites invested in furthering the transgender agenda. And let's not forget the pharmaceutical and technological industries that benefit from the growing number of individuals who become medical patients for life. Hormones and sex reassignment surgery do not transform anyone into the opposite sex, no matter how closely one identifies with that sex. Sex is a biological, scientifically based reality. Individuals are being told that they are not okay as they were created, and their dignity is violated. The actual cause of their suffering is not adequately addressed. I am here today as an advocate for those who struggle with gender dysphoria, for their families, and as a representative of a profession in which the guiding ethical principle of first do no harm is being violated. The protection of the conscious rights of individuals who practice evidence-based medicine formed in this principle must be secured, lest we merely become technicians prescribing medications and performing procedures with no rational thought to the consequences of creating hormone and surgery-dependent experimentees. A better treatment option would be to address the underlying mental health issues and concerns that are likely leading to these children and adolescents to identify as transgender or gender diverse. There are therapists out there who are taking on the role as compassionate companions and are actually spending time with their patients and parents, working through history, experiences, and addressing the whole of the individual. In this form of therapy, the body, mind, and soul can be brought together in a unified manner in which they were created. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natasha. Pardon, got a little bit of a cold. So I'm Natasha Chart. I'm the board chair of the Women's Liberation Front. And in 2015, I was fired from my position with a reproductive health organization as their campaign and fundraising director for my opinions on this topic. And so my story, and first, thank you, Grace, and thanks to Heritage for inviting me and having me on here, which I'm sure you're probably a little surprised to find yourselves inviting feminists to your events. So my story about the effects of the gender identity movement on my life and work is something of a Me Too story, but maybe not in the way that would be expected. When the first stories came out, and the ones that everyone heard about, there were stories about inappropriate contact, but also the follow-up to that was what happened when women said no. And in a lot of cases, it would be one thing if it's just a man making a pass, and it's maybe a regrettable incident that you move on from, but it's another thing when she says no, and then he trashes her work to their boss and spreads false rumors about her to their coworkers, or tries to keep her from getting work anywhere else. And then maybe this guy does that to another woman and another over and over. With many of these men, the follow-on story to the initial incident was a man destroying a woman's professional credibility and her ability to participate in the public sphere. And so the other story of it is reprisals and the way abusive men can amplify harassment through an entire network of friends and colleagues that can transform sexual harassment in the workplace from an isolated incident to a cascading, career-stopping disaster, derailing a woman's opportunity and career for years. And it's that type of harassment that has pursued many women who have criticized gender identity. And that's the story of how the men who are mainly running this type of politics have operated. They get women like me fired for objecting to the idea that there could be such a thing as a male lesbian, or for objecting to the sex industry. Most of these men are dogged supporters or patrons of the sex industry in all its forms. My employer told me that they were being threatened with loss of support from a number of different people until I was fired. False stories were spread about me to my coworkers, and it's been made abundantly clear that my career in politics on the left in the US is over. About the idea of the male lesbian, which I was fired over rejecting on principle. Even women who are ourselves interested in men, or women of faith who perhaps don't believe in pursuing same-sex attraction, understand the danger of a man who'd sexually pester lesbians, as we would understand the danger of any man who refuses to hear it when a woman says no. And all decent men, of any faith or none, can understand that a man who won't respect a woman's no is a lawless man. He's someone who can't be trusted to obey any authority. He's someone who can't be trusted to sincerely abide by any creed. But if you want to work in politics on the US political left now, you have to affirm that humans can change sex, or that we have some property of mind that overrides our reproductive biology. And I say affirm because no one really believes this, as it isn't true. So one must affirm the existence of the male lesbian, and one must ignore it when these men sexually harass lesbians, which I have definitely seen go on. One must believe now on the US left that a man like Robert Kozolek, who once he was put in prison, he's now known as Michelle Kozolek, who's incarcerated for nearly beheading his wife Cheryl and dumping her body in a parking lot, is a victim who requires the state of Massachusetts to give him cosmetic genital surgery and probably move him to a women's prison, where the inmates at MCI Framingham are terrified of him and do not want to have to share showers or share prison cells with him. No human being can change sex. There's no state of mind that overrides the reality of the sexed body, nor the serious implications for medical care that come with it. But last week, a woman on the left who agrees with my stance on gender identity had told me how much she disagrees with my decision to work at all or to appear with people on the right. And she told me this without any sense of irony rather shortly after she said that she would lose her own very public job if she spoke out. And so she doesn't. So you don't know her name and she's not here to tell her story. I know a woman who worked at an environmental organization who was put on a disciplinary suspension because she said in a diversity meeting that she was uncomfortable washing blood off her hands in her workplace's gender-neutral bathrooms, where a man might walk in at any time. While grown women can't even complain about wanting privacy to deal with menstruation, the situation is worse for girls. UNESCO recently said that single-sex toilets with private hand washing are a necessity for the education of girls after menarche, so that they can keep themselves clean and avoid being shamed by boys. Whereas in countries like the US, Canada, and the UK, school toilet facilities are being made mixed sex. Some girls in England and Wales have already been reported as missing school over the harassment that they now face with the introduction of mixed-sex school toilets, while overall in the UK, 90% of complaints about voyeurism and sexual assault in public changing rooms come from mixed-sex facilities. But we in the United States are being told that we have no need for what privacy girls need in India, Uganda, Bolivia, or in refugee camps around the world, where single-sex public toilet facilities are considered the gold standard for the safety of women and girls. But the idea that period shaming or harassment of girls and women has ended in developed nations is simply false as well as chauvinist. Only now we get punished for saying so. The men who support the gender identity movement have done everything in their power to shut us up. My colleague at Feminist Current, Megan Murphy, was banned from Twitter for calling a man him. And in that case, it was a man who sues female beauticians who don't want to wax his testicles and who talks in public about wanting to show 10-year-old girls how to use tampons. Megan lost her advertisers last year because another man, one who openly sells sexual domination services on Twitter, criticized her to Twitter. Because both of these Canadian men identify as women, we are no longer even allowed to say, that man over there is harassing women and girls and he is making us uncomfortable. And what we can't even name, we certainly cannot fight. Some of the social media publishing companies have responded to these men by treating us like they have treated no one else except, and I can't believe I'm making this comparison, but the Islamic State in systematically removing us from the public conversation and banning us for life from their platforms. Women have lost websites or been permanently banned for saying that men are male, or sometimes even for mentioning their names. The tech companies have allowed these men to use their abuse reporting tools to harass women and to silence all their critics, and given a small handful of men the power to get any woman in the world who negatively mentions them banned from public conversation. In the UK, the police might even call you in for questioning if you misgender someone on Twitter. That is, if you correctly refer to their sex, which is now against Twitter's terms of service. The police won't threaten us with jail for speech in the US, but the coercion has been a common denominator. For a few years now, US federal funding for women's shelters has been tied to their willingness to let men stay there if they say that they're women. If the other women complain about these men sharing their rooms or their showers, the shelter is required by federal funding stipulations to either re-educate the woman to accept it or they have to kick her out, not him. But all the women's anti-violence organizations publicly support gender identity now, a change that happened suddenly and as soon as funding for shelters was tied to accepting these policies. Before funding was tied to accepting gender identity, a survey commissioned by the Obama administration showed that 70% of women's shelters in the US refused all male clients regardless of gender claims. In Canada, gender activists are now working to destroy the funding of the last women-only rape crisis shelter in the country on the basis of the demand that women be allowed in, or that men be allowed in, rather. In the face of this siege from governments, corporations, and unchecked private mobs, not many women speak out. And I've heard some people ask, well, where are the feminists? If this is a women's rights issue, where are they? And so some of us have been fired, Some women have had their businesses, careers, or reputations destroyed by mobs. They've had their family's welfare threatened. They've had their gatherings physically attacked. They've been assaulted at peaceful meetings. They've had bomb threats called into their conferences. Or they've been intimidated into silence, watching all of this go on. And in that silence, several countries and US states have been systematically violating women's human rights by putting men in women's prisons if those men claim a female identity. And this includes men who've murdered women and male sex offenders who've gone on offending against incarcerated women. In that silence, parents are being threatened with the loss of the custody of their children or the loss of their children's very lives to suicide if the parents won't agree with educators or doctors to affirm their children's supposed need for chemical sterilization. Then later, parents are told to affirm that doctors must cut off or core out their children's genitals, along with giving them hormone regimens that we know are dangerous to cardiovascular health. In the US, doctors are giving 13-year-old girls mastectomies, throwing 14-year-old girls into menopause, and surgically castrating 16-year-old boys. So some of us will still say that gender identity and self-identification are a form of hateful discrimination against women, and a threat to children, and a silencing of our complaints about sexual harassment. And gender identity policy has only become law through the practice of hateful discrimination against women and the silencing of our voices. And I would ask that people who wish to be protected from sex stereotype discrimination, which I fully support, be granted that protection without destroying women's rights and legal standing. Because in the silence also of so many doctors and counselors and school administrators and politicians and judges and everyone else in authority who should be able to see that something terribly wrong is happening here, it is hard for people to believe that the voices of women and girls matter very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here, and I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting this important and too often marginalized discussion. As you've already heard here today, the debate about gender identity has much more dramatic implications than most people are ever invited to consider. An appropriate question for the Commission on the Status of Women: what are women's rights if anyone can be a woman? And how empowered are we really if we cannot even speak the truth about our sex without being punished by men? I agree emphatically with Natasha that since the dawn of time, the oppression of women has been largely rooted in our biological sex, not our feelings about gender. Anatomy discriminates. So do sexual assault and domestic violence statistics, athletic opportunities, and a litany of other inequalities for which sex-based protections exist in the first place. There is an obvious physical power differential between the sexes. To deny this reality is anti-science. It's also anti-common sense. As a rape survivor who lost her job of 17 years over a policy granting men unfettered access to girls' showers, I have been asked to specifically address the issue of gender identity as it relates to women's right to bodily privacy in intimate spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, and shelters. Before I do, though, I want to make two things crystal clear about what I believe. Number one, trans women are men. It is not a basic human right for them to shower next to me at the gym. It is a basic human right for me to say no. Insisting otherwise is the very definition of rape culture and an affront on the consent that so many people are pretending to care about. Number two, a violation of privacy is in and of itself an injury. I shouldn't have to prove that someone is about to rape me in order for my boundary to be considered valid. The risks here are not merely physical. Who can quantify or measure the unspeakable emotional harm of stripping women of the right to the word no? On the plane ride over here, I was reading about women and girls in refugee camps across the globe. There is a high demand in these camps for adult diapers. Why? Because the risk of these women and girls of being sexually assaulted while walking to the bathroom at night is so high that many of them would prefer to sit for hours in their own excrement rather than chance being attacked en route to the bathroom. Similarly, as recently as 2011, Amnesty International produced a report detailing the extreme importance of creating female-only restrooms in third world countries, both as a deterrent to sexual assault and as a privacy measure to accommodate the numerous cultural stigmas about menstruation. Their statement reads, "Separate toilets at school mean more girls are likely to attend in the first place, and more girls are likely to stay after puberty to complete their education." So while third world countries fight for basic protections for females in the form of sex-segregated toilets, here in the West, we are actively flushing these protections down the drain in the name of progress. Make no mistake, the risk is high here as well. Some fears are well-founded. Every day for the past 4 years, I've received Google alerts in my email inbox. Alerts for any article with the inclusion of the words or the terms bathroom, assault, or voyeurism. And every day without fail, there's at least one. We used to say that one was too many, but now that we're well beyond that, what is the magic number going to be? The voyeurism incidents at Target have more than tripled since they enacted their foolish bathroom policy. Christopher Hambrook went by the name Jessica to infiltrate 2 women's shelters in Canada before raping women in both. If women can't go to shelters to seek safety, where are they supposed to go? 3 women in Fort Worth, Texas prisons had to file a complaint and a lawsuit against the prison because a transgender inmate had been placed with them and allowed to sexually assault them. There's Karen White, who did the same thing in the UK. Just this last week, we read about drag queen's story hour at the library in Texas, where a registered sex offender, going by a different name, was allowed to read books to kids. As an assault survivor, I've worked long and studied hard to set unapologetic boundaries, to trust my instincts, to heed my red flags, and to speak up if I feel unsafe. Before, when a man was entering my locker room at the Y, I could call the police, let them know my concern, with the reasonable expectation that they would kick the man out. Now I can't do that. In fact, when I was getting fired at the Y, I asked them, well, now that that standard has changed, at what point am I allowed to voice concern? Is it when he starts undressing next to me and my daughter in the locker room? Well, of course, people are going to undress in the locker room, so that wasn't good enough. I finally asked, what if somebody has an erection next to me in the shower? At that point, am I allowed to say something? And the response I got was that sometimes warm water has that effect on people, and that is no cause for concern. Gender identity laws in my state strip me of the ability to do any of these things, insisting that my boundaries are nothing more than bigotry, that my instincts are delusional, that I should just get over my fears and keep my mouth shut, like a good girl. Because my voice is unwelcome and even violent. It takes some expert-level gaslighting to convince millions of women across the globe that trans people will die if we don't compromise our personal boundaries. It reads like a page from a domestic violence survivor's handbook. Honey, if you really love me, you would give me everything I tell you to. And trans activists are demanding a great deal, primarily at the expense of women and girls. We continue to live in a culture that has so normalized the mistreatment of women that we don't even blink when rap artists go platinum with lyrics about raping nuns or shooting bitches and dumping their corpses into trash cans. When our favorite athletes beat their wives or push their pregnant girlfriends down the stairs, we don't boycott the NFL for their decision to respond by slapping these guys with a single game penalty and continuing to line their pockets with millions. So maybe I shouldn't be surprised that nearly every woman I know who has taken a stand on trans issues has been met with a series of rape and death threats. We've had our addresses published on the internet. I've received a literal hex in the mail. One particularly enthusiastic individual located a picture of my then 5-year-old daughter on an old Instagram account I had forgotten about and commented that she looked like a crusty cunt that deserved to be raped. So it's still pretty startling to me, though, given the frequency and severity of the abusive treatment to which women are routinely subjected without recourse, that it's our use of accurate pronouns that's being deemed violent. As we sit here today, 2 of my friends in the UK are currently undergoing actual investigation by the police over pronoun infractions. There is some serious cognitive dissonance in play here. The reality is that everyone knows that women can't have penises, but unfortunately, the status of women is such that the majority are afraid to say so. We cannot claim to be empowered if we live in fear of telling the truth about our own sex. As I've learned in my own recovery process and has been underscored by the Me Too movement and the scandals in Hollywood and the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church and others, abuse is something that thrives in an environment of secrecy and silence and fear. Transactivism as a political movement is an abusive movement with devastating implications for women and girls in particular. I, for one, have no intention of remaining silent while women are erased. I'll take my cue from one of my personal heroines, a bold woman named Esther, who risked her life to save her people by defying the king's laws and using her voice to advocate for truth and justice. I am grateful to stand in solidarity with these other brave women who are willing to do the same. If we want to claim to fight for women, perhaps we had best begin by being willing to even define who and what we are, adult human females.
Hello and good afternoon. Thank you to your Grace and the Heritage Foundation for having me. I speak to you today, as you can see, on a diverse panel, but we all agree on one thing, and that is the definition of woman, and the importance of that definition being tied to biology and not self-perception. Our bodies are what bind women together in this room and across the globe. Our bodies and the similar experiences that they afford us. And while we may come from different philosophies about life, we all agree, as I said, on one thing, which is not just the definition of woman, but how crucial it is to keep it tied to biology and not allow it to be corrupted to the trans movement, by the trans movement. The trans movement, as we've heard already in detail, is dangerous to women and girls. And it sets back women's progress hundreds of years by suggesting that someone could be born in the wrong body. Transgender activists are saying that a set of feelings are allocated only to women and another set allocated only to men. And isn't this conforming to the same stereotypes that we have been fighting against for so long, especially in this country? And that is that there is only one narrow way to be a woman, or one narrow way to be a man. And why would we, by changing the definition of man and woman to match feelings instead of biology, collude with those narrow ideas? What does it feel like to be a woman? I'm sure that the answer is as varied as the women in this room. But what does it mean to be a woman is tied to our biological reality. And with the transgender movement taking off with such speed as it has, have we allowed ourselves to ask the question, when exactly did we come to accept gendered thoughts and gendered feelings? Men and women are different, but not so categorically so in our thinking that one could feel like the other. We are full human beings, free to think as we wish without questioning our authenticity as men or women. Bruce Jenner, which is probably how most of us came to know about the transgender movement, he said when he was in an interview, initially his first interview as a trans woman, he said to Diane Sawyer, "Bruce is a lie, she is not a lie." In that interview, he looked more feminine than he ever had, but still not enough to pull off an illusion of being a woman. Months later, on the cover of Vanity Fair, he looked even more feminine. And some trans women do look like biological women. But as Dr. Paul McHugh said, a medical doctor who once performed these surgeries but stopped when he saw that they were not improving people's lives. He said sex change is biologically impossible. People who undergo sex reassignment surgery do not change from men to women, or vice versa. Rather, they become feminized men or masculinized women. The feminist movement has fought for decades to say, don't reduce us to our bodies. But not reducing us to our bodies is not the same as saying, erase our bodies. The famous scholar and philosopher Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. For him, the essence of the self was the mind, and maybe there are some people who agree with that. But I do not know that there would be many women who could agree with that, because so many of the great moments in our lives are tied to our biological reality: menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause, and many others. We are not our bodies, but if we leave our bodies out of the conversation, if we allow for the definition of women to reflect thoughts and feelings over biology, we do ourselves a great disservice. But in fact, the erasure of women's bodies has been happening for a long time. The great feminist, whose name I may be saying wrong, Simone de Beauvoir, said that women are not born, they are made. And thus became the push to accept masculinity, to accept manhood or womanhood as a social construct and not a biological reality. So the transgender movement or moment is seeking to only put the nail in the coffin. Our failure to center women's biology will only continue to put most women further and further behind in their own movement. For instance, why are there such passionate discussions about trans women being able to use women's bathrooms, and no discussions about having more nursing stations, no discussions about there being more changing stations, no discussions about more access to menstruation pads, issues that affect most women? So the silencing has already begun. If we are truly interested in fighting for women's rights, if women are truly at the center of the fight for women, then why wouldn't we primarily focus on issues that affect most women, and not just here, but across the globe? As the title of this session states, biology is not bigotry. So it is not our intent to exclude trans women because we don't like them. It's our intent to exclude them because definitions always have boundaries. And as one of my colleagues already stated, if we can't even define women, how can we help them? But I do agree with trans women and trans activists about one thing, and that is that discrimination can be deadly. And so we need to find solutions that ensure their safety while not at the expense of biological women and girls. But I ask, what do these solutions look like? As one of the other panelists already mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, these surgeries do not give trans women or men or trans men improved life conditions. And I think back to a more racist period in our history when some Black people chose to pass, those who could pass, chose to pass as white people. Were they happier hiding their African ancestry and pretending to be white? In some ways, I'm sure, but in other ways, they were miserable. So are these real solutions? I think they are at best short-term solutions and at worst not solutions at all. And I turn back to Bruce Jenner and what he said initially when he got his sex reassignment surgery. He said, these were his thoughts reported in the Vanity Fair interview. He said, "What did I just do? What did I just do to myself?" On an online forum of post-op patients, there were many similar sentiments. One user said, "I am grieving at how I have mutilated my body." And the author known for writing about his experience as a former trans woman, talks about how he regrets going through the surgery. So even if we are to talk about the trans issue, we are playing a dangerous game with them as well. A man or a boy whose penis has been surgically removed can't go back in time. Imagine if we spent the money that we spend on surgery and drugs on therapy and learning self-love. We should be teaching a message of self-acceptance instead of buying into the latest surgeries or believing we're born into the wrong body. So for this and many other reasons, we cannot allow the redefinition of women. That redefinition, as Leonard Sachs says in his book, Why Gender Matters, we don't do anyone any favors by pretending that these male-female differences do not exist. Ignoring reality always comes at a cost, and the cost is to both trans people and women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your remarks. I'd like in a moment to open up to questions from the audience, but before I do, I would like to ask the first question. As you've all persuasively argued, gender identity ideology poses a number of dangers to women and girls because it threatens to erase the legal and social protections that were intended to help us. If the word women can be redefined to apply to anyone and everyone, then it will effectively mean nothing, and efforts to protect women in international law, economic development, and access to social protection systems, which is the subject of this year's Commission on the Status of Women, will really no longer be exclusive to women. So my question for you is, what advice would you give to delegates and grassroots activists from around the world who are here now about how to stop the advance of gender identity ideology, either in their own countries and communities or through the UN system? Whoever wants to take that first.
Well, I would say, in the US, we have something that's just been reintroduced to Congress called the Equality Act, which includes protections for gender identity. And this doesn't mean, as I think most people would be sympathetic to and understand it to mean, simply protecting people who have gender dysphoria from, say, workplace discrimination or from losing their housing. And the law makes no reference to any medical condition, so it's not really talking about those people. What it means, the interpretations around it are that you have to treat someone according to what sex they say they are rather than what sex that they actually are in every respect, and it removes every single protection for women. Like if you go to the doctor and you say, well, I would like a female chaperone, or I would like a female doctor to examine me, for like a gynecological exam, it takes away the right of the medical office to then say, well, we have to assign this person a female staffer. Now, whether that would come up a lot or not, it's being taken away as a right because of these gender identity protections that are included in there. But if those were taken out, there are protections against sex stereotype discrimination. And I think that something that everyone can and should do is to expand the definition of protection from sex stereotype discrimination for all people, which I think fairly would cover all of the reasonable use cases that people are concerned about, like being fired from a job for which one is otherwise qualified for just because you have a quirky taste in dress, or you want to change your name from Bob to Michelle. I don't think that people should be fired over something like that. So that's, I think a lot of people would agree, like a reasonable middle ground. And in that way, like women have, in some ways, more freedom than men in terms of, say, dress, for instance, because there's almost not a way for women to do drag anymore. You know, like I'm wearing pants today. 100 years ago, I could have been arrested for indecency for wearing pants. And that's just not the case anymore. I can show up in pants and no one says, oh, why are you dressed like a man today? I'm just dressed like a woman. That's how a woman dresses. Sometimes women wear pants and it doesn't change anything about that. And so I think that a more expansive understanding of sex stereotype discrimination and protecting everyone equally from that would solve a lot of the reasonable legal concerns that people have.
Anyone else want to take that?
I have so many thoughts about this as somebody who's been actively involved in primarily grassroots efforts on this issue, and it's kind of frustrating to know that, you know, when I first fell down this rabbit hole, nobody was talking about gender identity in a political sense. I remember going home and actually Googling and looking for articles about this topic. And right now the newsfeed might be saturated, but there was nothing. And so I've watched as state by state by state slowly gets introduced to this for the first time. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I made early on, I was probably a little bit more naive, was thinking that surely if we were nice enough, if we were kind enough, if we were gentle enough in our approach, and that trans people could see that we actually don't hate them, that if they were actually being harmed, we would intervene. And I've gotten a little bit thicker skin and a little bit tougher about that, because what I've found is that the people driving this agenda, not transgender people themselves, but the activists, don't care. And it's not a matter of finding middle ground or commonality, it's a matter of winning. And I think the price is too high for us to be as gentle as maybe we feel inclined to be. We need to name this for what it is. We need to talk about the fact that kids who aren't even old enough to consent to piercing their own ears are having double mastectomies. We need to talk about the boys in Connecticut who are taking hard-fought girls' athletic scholarships. We need to be willing to call a spade and go a little bit more intensely than we would. The other thing I would say is that as often as possible, I think that it is important to not allow this conversation to happen in the cloak of the civil rights movement, okay? Because I think it's absurdly offensive to conflate transgender people's demands for special rights with the actual hard-fought civil rights of African Americans in the early 1900s here in America. I mean, transgender people have never been codified into law as 3/5 human. They haven't been sold as slaves. They've never been forced to sit at the back of the bus. They have equal access to any spot that anybody else of their sex currently does. And so I think a lot of times when we hear a civil rights thing, we pump the brakes because we want to distance ourselves from the label of bigot. So if you're going to be active in this, you're going to be called a bigot. I guess that would be my advice, and you need to be okay with that. But you also need to call it out, because it is not okay to pretend like this is something that it's not. All people are deserving of human dignity and protection, but this is not a civil rights issue. It's profoundly uncivil what's actually happening.
I think now to take some questions from the audience, I think we'll have a volunteer come up here and give the microphone to, if you could come up and identify yourself, tell us your name and where you're from, and make sure to please ask a question. Maybe we can just kind of make a little line. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, you have to keep it plugged in. And so people will come up here to ask a question. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tracy Montague from Northern Ireland, Training for Women's Network. It's a question, if you're saying that biology can't get it wrong, that a man can't be born into a woman's body and a woman can't be born into a man's body, biology does get it wrong, because some people are born with multiple reproductive organs or no reproductive organs. Some people are born with 3 kidneys. Some people are born with 6 digits. Some people are born with disfigurations in their appearance. So are we saying now that we should just leave people as they are? Are we saying that somebody who has born with no kidneys, then you shouldn't then disfigure their body and take a kidney out to help somebody? Are we saying that we shouldn't give blood to save people in our planet? So I think that you're taking one extreme, and if that's your view, that's great. But I hope you have the same view, an extreme view, in any sort of tampering with biology. Because I think that even from a Christian point of view, if God gave us the power to save humans and to take kidneys out to give to somebody else and to change somebody's personal disfiguration or to change a cleft lip or to take off multiple birthmarks just so that they feel better in their own appearance and better in their own selves, then why doesn't that doctor have the right to help somebody who has been born into the different body? Because if biology can get it wrong from the grassroots, who are we to say that they don't get it wrong with gender? And that's my question, and it's my comment.
I think that's an excellent question. You are exactly right that biology does not always get it right. There are individuals, and what she's referring to, individuals born with intersex disorders. And they may have abnormal chromosomes, but a lot of them have they have a defect or an inappropriate amount of a certain enzyme that leads in a pathway to producing the steroids that you or I would identify as female or another individual identifies as male. So I think it's very important, but I think to get at the heart of the matter is we can't define normal development based on a very rare condition. So the other important thing is when you're referring to those who may need transplants to survive, maybe those individuals who are on dialysis and they have no functional kidneys, or and they're on a transplant list. Is it wrong to take a kidney from another individual to give to that person? So once again, it goes back to the principle of totality and integrity, okay? So if this individual with 2 functioning kidneys is matched to give a kidney to their son or daughter, for example, then they can do that because they will live with 1 kidney. Now, to take out an individual's heart to give to another would be killing this individual so that another may live. So you have to look at all of the proportional things within the context, and you have to look at each individual and the benefits and risk of each procedure and the benefits and risk of the acceptance of whatever the procedure. But you don't want to harm another individual at the sake of making this one better. Does that help?
Not really, because what about the mental harm and the mental turmoil?
Right, you're exactly right. So that's the big issue here, the mental harm. What are we doing? Endocrinologists and surgeons do not treat mental health.
Exactly.
They do not treat it. So what are we doing? That is what I think we're proposing. Is a better solution is to actually help these people with whatever struggles they may have. Maybe they don't recognize that they have struggles, but it is at least dignifying to address that, and not for an individual to show up to an appointment and be offered on their first visit only hormones and this pathway without evaluating what got them to your office or your clinic.
I mean, I totally disagree, and I really think that you're
Other people ask questions. I think we do need to take the next question.
Hi there, my name is Louie. I actually just just almost fainted when I was standing in this line waiting to ask a question, which rarely happens to me, but I just think I want you to realize the impact of what you're saying, in that I, as a person who doesn't really know what their gender is, if I'm being truly honest, stood up here to try and say something to you, and that was my bodily reaction. And I think I just want to like present my body to you, because I feel you're constructing trans people to be something that's so frightening, that's so terrifying. And I'm just so confused. What about my body is so frightening to you? What about me is so terrifying? And to be honest, most of the time I've been sat here just not really feeling anything, but it suddenly hit me, and I want you to know that I hold you responsible for the deaths of trans people. Can I finish, please? Whether those are my friends, whether those are people in the trans and gender non-conforming discussion group I go to, many of whom are homeless, many of whom are sex workers, many of whom are on the fringes of this society. Whether that's people I speak to on a crisis phone line for LGBT survivors of violence, which is based in New York. It's an amazing organization called the Anti-Violence Project. You should all check it out. All I want to say is that if you were to say these things to those people,
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
You're good. You're good. First of all, what's your
can I
name?
please finish?
Yeah, you
Can I please finish? My name's Louie.
Louis.
All I can think of to finish is last week at this discussion group that I go to, one of my dear friends, their name is Martha, beautiful, inspiring, trans feminine person, and they said, they just laughed, they just sat back and laughed, and they were like, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if trans people grew wings, because we're so amazing. And fuck yeah, you know, we can grow wings. So it's more of a reflection, but please think of my body. I'm not scary, I promise.
Thank you for standing up and saying that, and I want you to know, I don't know if you're leaving, but I do want you to know that none of us here are criticizing trans people, we're criticizing the movement. And there is a difference. And anyone who's going through pain, I hope we all sympathize. And we're not, no one's judging your body, right? We're not looking at you and, well, okay, I'm not judging your body. We're judging the movement, and I think we want to be honest about what we're doing
Giving
here.
people space doesn't take away from other people's space.
Thank you.
No one
Sometimes
is
it
threatening,
does.
and no, it doesn't. You
Well, we
cannot
gave
cherry
many
pick
examples.
examples. You cannot cherry pick examples.
But you just
That's
said
not
no, it
fair.
doesn't in an absolute way, and then we gave examples. I know, okay, this is an upsetting conversation for some, of course. My background is in psychology. If someone wanted to talk to me about whatever issue they were going through, we would talk. I'm sorry.
What's your degree in?
Psychology.
Is it a bachelor's, is it a master's, is it a PhD?
It's a master's in
matter.
psychology.
Okay, they should probably take that back.
And you should not be rude.
My point is simply that we do empathize, and I think it's unfortunate that simply because we have different points of views about the movement, that we're being seen as hating individuals. That's not the case. Just wanted to get that.
Exactly.
May I make one comment? So, I'm going to come at it from a scientific point of view.
Here's the other mic.
I'm going to come at it from a scientific point of view and a physician. We do not hate anyone's body. We are here to understand and to help people through this process. The thing is, if we have And I'm just going to say, if I have an individual, if I were to work in the emergency room, and I have someone who comes in with chest pain, am I going to evaluate this individual as a male or a female? Since there are biological differences and there are risks with how I treat the individual. So in an emergent situation, which way should I treat the individual? As they're born or as they refer to be? So I think it's important, not only in the realm of what we're talking about here in a social, but also in a medical perspective. I think it's important to take each individual, their dignity and their humanity, and to take care of them in the best manner. And that does require science.
So I'd like to address this. It's come up a couple times that, I feel tremendous sympathy for anyone who's very unhappy with the prescribed sex stereotyped roles that people have in society, because I've always been uncomfortable with them. And I feel sympathy for people who are uncomfortable with their bodies and who hate their bodies, because I've always hated mine. And I don't actually know if I have ever met a woman who doesn't hate her body. I'm not sure one exists. I mean, maybe she does. I hope that a woman exists somewhere who does not hate her body. But I wouldn't bet money on it. But unhappiness isn't a sex. Being unhappy is not a sex classification. And as a feminist with a concern about male violence, I'm not afraid of people who identify as trans at all. I am concerned about what gender identity policy does in terms of allowing men access to vulnerable women and places where women are required by law to be and to be vulnerable. And that is my concern, the way that discourse hides that whole aspect and erases male violence and erases women's ability to name that, which is absolutely vital for any feminist practice and any building of solidarity among women across our shared experiences.
Okay, so thank you for giving me my time for the question. So I have one doubt. So in Mexico City, or at least in Mexico in general, this current movement is targeting the youth, where they are more malleable and they can in certain ways control the way they think. So how are we supposed to assure that our youth is not going to be given a naive thought of what sex is? And how do we give them the real idea and how the biological aspects affect on it?
So I've thought about this a lot. We've talked about this. We even talked about this last night. And it seems to me that there are groups of people on both sides of the political aisle. On the far extreme with conservatives, again, this is centered on sexual stereotypes that Natasha's already raised. As recently as 2 weeks ago, I was told by a man who is prominent in right-wing circles that my intelligence as a female was of questionable value because my true purpose in life was to be a breeder. True story, I have the screenshots to show it. I encounter this often enough on the right, where there is a definite and a clear-cut path. This is what women are and this is what your roles are. So anybody who does not fit that role, like me, as a woman who has a voice and something to contribute to society, who works outside the home, is alienated and marginalized and pushed into this kind of other category. On the opposite side of that, you have now a whole movement that is taking these sexual stereotypes and redefining the existence of what men and women are. So they're saying, because I like pink and I'm artistic, and I don't identify with things that are traditionally masculine, therefore I am a woman. So it's two wings on the same decrepit bird that is not serving anybody. So wherever you sit, on either side, I would say aggressively challenge sexual stereotypes. You know, it might not be your thing to let men wear dresses or nail polish, but my gosh, if they're embracing their healthy bodies, if they're happy in who they are, if they don't feel inclined to mutilate themselves because they think there's something so tremendously wrong with them, is that not a good thing? Is that not progress? And on the right, my gosh, I mean, I think that is one of the most devastating things that I realized since kind of falling down this hole, is that we do so much damage in so many ways in terms of sexual stereotypes that we push people toward this. So I would say, challenge the heck out of sexual stereotypes, let people be who they are, but don't insist that in order to be who you are, you have to mutilate your body. That is not normal.
I think we just had a clear example of what my question is about. I just want to know, how can we approach trans people without them feeling attacked or as if we were rejecting them? Because even though we may be open to listening to them or just our intentions are good, they might still feel like we're trying to do harm to them.
People who want to know what our hearts are will know. And I think that's what I was referring to when I said earlier that you need to expect to be rejected and called a bigot regardless of what your true motives are. That's been hard. That's been difficult because I don't think anybody up here has any malintent for anybody. I have had excellent one-on-one conversations with transgender people, most of them trans men, not as many with the men who believe that they're women, where we've hugged it out at the end. But again, you're going to encounter what just happened here, which I find particularly, and I'm going to say it every time I encounter it, it's abusive. To tell us that because we have a different point of view, that because we are saying that there is a difference between men and women, that we are responsible for people's deaths, that is what domestic abusers do.
Absolutely.
To silence women. It's nonsense. It's not going to work with me. So I can love you and care about you, but I'm going to call you on that crap every single time. So you aren't going to make everybody happy. If that's your goal, you might as well not get into this discussion at all.
Right, I can love you and care for you, but I don't want you to exist. Right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing. My name is, that's what I'm hearing, right? I love you, but please don't exist. So, and according to the UN, that is one of the criterias that the special representative on genocide has for genocide. Right? Right? Okay, so let's just start there. My name is Reverend Patricia Ackerman, and I would like to make a comment. Okay?
Can you make a clarification about what it means that we don't want them to exist?
I'll
That
tell
we
you
advocated for death?
I'll tell you later. I've been listening to your hurtful and hateful rhetoric toward trans people. It's oppressive, sensationalized, untrue, immoral, dehumanizing, and it violates the human rights of trans people no matter what you say. It violates the human rights. Whatever happened, doctor, to do no harm? That's what I want to ask you. I know, and I have worked for decades with trans individuals who are living wonderful, service-oriented lives. They are some of the most wonderful and brilliant people that I have known. When are you going to stop trying to tell people who they can be when they are living quality lives? When will you respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Your horrendous discrimination and attacks destroy trans lives. Did you hear that young person who was talking? Your discrimination encourages extreme violence and the murder of trans people. It's very upsetting. You're like a group of mean girls that I used to have in high school. No. You say you do not want to hurt transgender people. That is outrageous, and it's a lie. You not only hurt them, but you kill them. Their blood is on your hands, and you're smiling.
How can you expect to be taken seriously?
Exactly.
I am a serious person.
I think just a moment. I think the point of this is to rally discontent in here. But I also ask, has anybody seen, which I'm sure many have, the 30-year study that came out of Sweden looking at transgender individuals as adults who have gone through the process. And if you look at those results, still, after looking at those results, there is a great number who have suicidal ideations, who have committed suicide, and who run the risk of significant cardiovascular disease. So there are studies out there. And I think to label us as coming out to kill people, we wouldn't be here as advocates for these individuals. I wouldn't be here as an advocate for children who I take care of on a frequent basis, sick, very sick children, in order to save their lives. So I think to label that is really a disservice, but it's a disservice to this community because you're not recognizing their full dignity. And I ask you that those who promote affirmation, are they going to be there for those who desist and detransition in 10 years?
We have time for just a few more.
I hear you. I'm trying to listen to you and hold your space, and what I hear from all five of you is a lot of pain. And you're right, the patriarchy, the way the society and culture has been run for 400,000 years has been terrible. It's been terrible. But other ideas and other concepts of the body have also been around since humans have been around. And it doesn't harm you. You're not being harmed by the expansive notion of gender. I wish for you your hearts to open and to blossom, and for you to put all of your desire and love and wish for a more just and equitable world, to fight for women's rights, to say, no, we're not going to have patriarchy, oppression, poverty, this kind of inequality anymore. Fight for that. Put all of this passion in that. Recognize that you're in pain. It's hurtful. It's painful. The human experience is painful. But people existing outside of the gender spectrum that you feel comfortable with doesn't erase who you are. It never has, and it never will. You exist. You are here. Fight for people's dignity and rights. Spend that love there.
I do first want to say one thing I admire about activists, whether I agree with them or not, is their sincerity. And there's obviously a lot of passion there and empathy. However, we are continuously hearing that there is no harm. After you've heard example after example of the harm that is being done to women. So I don't understand I would love to ask some of you, where is that coming from? We've given you examples, so how can you continue to say there's no harm?
So one of the examples that I brought up is of a Canadian man who's gone around to over a dozen beauticians in Canada, female estheticians, and demanded that they wax his testicles because he says he's a woman and it is his right, and they are discriminating against him if they will not do this. So this is a man coming up to women and demanding, as a condition of keeping their jobs or of not having to pay an outrageous fine through the Human Rights Commission there, that they touch his genitals against their will when they have said that they only wish to provide services to other women. So this is a facilitation of pretty egregious sexual harassment by gender identity policy, which disappears sex. And this is a harm to women. And person after person has come up to say that because women are outraged by this type of sexual harassment, which many of us have faced in other contexts, because we are outraged by the sexual assault, that this means that there's something wrong with us. Whereas I think there would be something wrong with us if we were not outraged by it. One of the important practices of feminism is solidarity with women, is the centering of women in our empathy and in our concerns, and asking, how will this affect women? Are we putting women first? And this policy that's subjecting women to sexual harassment is, in my opinion, an absolute violation of this. And yet we're being told that we don't have enough sympathy and we don't have enough care and we don't have enough heart. And where is the heart for these women who are often making pretty marginal incomes, who are now being told that they face extremely steep fines for not touching a man's genitals? And that is just at the beginning of the harms that this does. And I would ask for people to have sympathy for women whom we cannot have sympathy for if we cannot even define, if we can't say that a woman is an adult human female. And we need to put women first in this discussion and have care and compassion for other women.
My name is Dr. Jean Hozinski. I'm a general internist, and I came here out of curiosity to hear both sides. And personally, I would like to thank the 5 women sitting on this panel. I have found them to be intelligent, well-spoken, scientific, grounded, and unemotional, as opposed to some of the responses we've had from the audience who have been emotional and have attacked these women who are here with good intention. I'd like then to address the primary question of this meeting, which was the erasure of women. And I would like to say to you, in my opinion, we need to look back to the 1950s with the development of the oral contraceptive pill, when what was good and natural in a woman was medicated away for the sake of unfettered sexual activity. It did not benefit women because in the process, if you read the World Health Organization standards, synthetic estrogens and progesterones are described as class 1 carcinogens. So for the sake of being totally available sexually, we have poisoned our bodies with class 1 carcinogens. And because unwanted pregnancies occurred, we then further violated our bodies with terminations of pregnancies. So I would say to you, and I'm not here to offend anybody, I'm here to ask you to think deeply, really deeply, about what it is to be a woman, and when did we begin to erase who we were, and what has that led to? Because if men and women can have sex without babies, well then women can have sex with women because they don't have babies, and men can have sex with men, and then what the heck does sex even mean anymore, and who are we? So I ask that only for us to begin to think deeply and fairly and honestly, not to attack each other, but to come at each other with a real goal of understanding what is the beauty of femininity and womanhood, and what is the beauty of masculinity and being a man.
Respond to that?
Sure. I expect that the questioner and I probably do not agree about many of these issues. But what I would say that a lot of us can agree on is that every time that there is, I hope that we can agree on this, every time that there is an unwanted pregnancy, there is a man responsible for that, and that they need to be held accountable for their actions. And I would hope that we could all come together on that kind of common ground, and for that sort of discussion to happen, we also need to agree on what a man is. Who is a man? It's as much up for debate now as the term woman, where men, I think, both on the right and left, seem in a terrible hurry to say that, well, if a person wants to wear a dress and lipstick, they cannot possibly be a man. This is not our brother. We got to kick him out. He can't sit with us anymore. I can't relate to him. I can't understand this person. He must be an alien now. And I think that a lot of this politics that we're seeing is men rejecting men, and men feeling internally so hurt by the idea of this rejection that they're like, well, I have to be a woman because I am ashamed, or I will be shamed by other men. And I would ask that men stop rejecting your brothers because they have a quirky sense of dress. it's not a medical condition. It's not a terrible tragedy.
Natasha, thank you again for your balanced response. And I think we probably would agree on far more than you would think. So this is the dialogue that I feel should be taking place here. A question, a response, with fairness and respect.
My name is Reverend Noctura Laza. I don't know whether this is a question or a comment, but since I have been here, there's been one sentence in my head, choice. I don't think any one of us, and especially our trans, I get so emotional to think about how these conversations that are so harmful, these conversations that has so much harm in a way that I don't think anyone will choose the life that is so hard, being discriminated, stigmatized, and the killing that has happened. It is not a choice. I think I always say that, you know, as a lesbian woman, if I had a choice, I would not be choosing the life that is so hard, that I get to be excluded, discriminated, called names, and back in my country where people are being killed and raped because of their sexual orientation. So it is not a choice, but because if it was a choice, I think people will choose the life that is being accepted by all of us. But the choice that people are not, it's not a choice.
May I ask you a question? As a lesbian, how would you feel if you were told that you must have sex with somebody who has a penis? That you are a bigot who needs to adjust your preferences if you do not include within your potential partners those who have male bodies but identify as women?
It's a realistic situation.
This happens all the time.
I have a whole bunch of screenshots.
Yeah.
A lot.
Because I think some of the most vocal voices that I've encountered on the left on this issue are from lesbians who have been relentlessly attacked and harassed by men who believe that they're women and say, now that I am a woman, you are a bigot if you don't accept me as a sexual partner. And sexual orientation and gender identity cannot coexist, because in order to say that you are exclusively attracted to one sex, you have to first be able to define what that sex is. So how would you feel if you were being forced to find yourself attracted to people you were not attracted to? I just did, thanks. Okay.
Can we acknowledge the blatant body erasure that just happened in that statement? That I am not allowed to be attracted to multiple genders?
You can. I asked her a question how she would feel. She identified herself as a lesbian, not as a bisexual woman. So I am responding specifically to her.
Attracted to genitalia. That's the assumption. That's just because of what she's woman. She likes everyone.
Excuse me, I'm bisexual myself, and I would say that talking about lesbians and lesbian attraction does not erase bisexuals, and that's a pretty obnoxious thing to say. So please don't embarrass all of us by that.
When you say force, like how would I feel if I am forced? Relationships are not forced. Attraction cannot be forced. So I would say that you can't force someone because it has to be, I look at you, I'm attracted to you, and I have a right to say no, I am not attracted to you. Not to say that now how would I feel when I'm being forced? Yes, force is force, but two people who are adults who can say no, I am not attracted to you, not force.
There's a young woman who founded a college LGBT club who was kicked out of that club for refusing to date trans-identified males. This happens all over the place. Young lesbians are shamed routinely on social media for rejecting sexual attraction to males. It is absolutely
an anti-lesbian, anti-gay movement that denies the reality of the sex body and sex attraction for anyone.
I know there are a lot more questions, but we're being asked to clear out the room now. So thank you all for coming, and